Hey guys, and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture, we're going to continue right where we left off. In our last lecture, we were discussing the uh, the United States, the growth of wealth in the United States during the 1950s. Um, and with that being said, I'd like to dive right back into where we left off. So we last left off talking about the growth of Las Vegas, a city that was founded in the middle of the desert and devoted to gambling initially, and sort of reflected the growing affluence in the republic. There was a lot more discretionary income. People were able to simply devote more and more of their money to leisurely pursuits. It wasn't this dread or this fear that had taken over people's lives during the long depression that Franklin Roosevelt's presidency mainly encompassed. This was a harkening back to the wealthy society or at least the on the surface wealthy society that the 1920s represented. Have we discussed in our lectures on the 1920s? Not everyone benefited during the 1920s. There was still a lot of poverty in the republic, even though there was this supposedly high living. During this time, there was a lot more of the wealth spread around, though not completely, but we'll get to that sort of toward the end of this lecture. Now, transportation. Possession of automobiles was becoming universal at this time. They were no longer luxury items. They hadn't really been luxury items since the 1920s. But in the late 1940s and 1950s, they had become quite uniquely an American necessity, with even the very poor having access to at least one automobile in the family. The interstate highways that were built during the Eisenhower years and proved to be a great boon for the economy were originally inspired by the German Autobahn and designed for the mass movement of troops and supplies in case of a great emergency, a great domestic emergency. Now, also during the 1950s, commercial airlines began to supplant the great transcontinental rail lines, which since the mid-19th century had not only been the preferred way to move goods, but also to travel. Now, the luxury train cars, like the Pullman trains, were the apogee of luxury. The airplane replaced the train for one simple reason: it was extremely faster. Just had the train replaced the old wagon trains that people used to go out west and to move goods and property. The plane supplanted the train because it was able to move people and goods faster. Just like the trains at first were a luxury for the wealthy, so too were the auto. So too. Let me go back for a minute. Just as the trains were a luxury, an item that really only the wealthy had access to, so too were the earliest the earlier commercial airplanes. Not many people could afford those tickets. And it was a really prestigious industry to be in at first. Pilots still maintain a lot of prestige, but just the sight of the first jets themselves, we still have a term for fast moving up in commerce. Jet setters, people who are always sort of in the know or always around a fashionable event. These jet setters, they sort of got their name. They sort of in a weird way acquired and gave a name to this sort of phenomenon. And of course, the air hostesses, had the first generation of stewardess were known. They also lent prestige to air travel. They really enhanced it. It was a very coveted job for a young woman to hold. The high wages of the 1950s enabled most homes to rely on a single wage earner, and it really reinforced for a very large percentage of the American population, for the American workforce, that that the men would go off to work while their spouses, the women, stayed at home with the children. It reinforced that had a social norm and set in the belief that the mothers would look after the baby boom children. And this thought was reflected in a lot of the literature at the time. Now, the scale of the scale of which really left Americans and observers in awe. There's this rarity because outside of the United States in the 1950s, this phenomenon wasn't happening. A lot of nations were still really reeling from the effects of World War II. A lot of the former titans were really reeling, and a lot of the aspiring nations, former first-line colonial possessions and so forth, they were battling to break free of colonial domination, and nobody else was really having this sort of like multi-class prosperity. Now, one of the things that really began to boom and to take hold of American society at this time was consumer credit. And if we go back to our lectures on mass manufacturing, we remember that Isaac Singer, the inventor, manufacturer, and marketer of the sewing machine, he sort of brought in the concept of consumer credit to sales, to sort of American businesses. Consumer credit reemerged at the time, and in the 1950s, it began to really become one of the bedrocks of American economic life. Everybody began to depend on credit, and the expansion of credit enabled nearly every family to live beyond its means without falling into the sort of trap that had happened to many people during the 1920s. The sort of excess that accompanied the 20s really didn't hit a lot of Americans in the 1950s and the way it had 30 years before. Now, the Cold War setting sort of tempered this new social opulence. Had the threat of nuclear war loomed on the horizon, children were taught bomb drills in schools, which were little more than simple sheltering techniques. I remember hearing a story from my parents and their siblings about just simply having to go under the desk, and a lot of them perplexingly asking, once they hit adulthood, what was hiding under a desk really going to do? But that was sort of the gist of it for school children, simply going under the desk. And I remember being a young student myself, and if anything happened, they would always say, just go under your desk. And simple sheltering techniques. Whoops. Okay. Simple sheltering techniques, where I left off. Sorry about that. Now, in the 1960s, the fallout shelter craze developed, with many companies beginning to sell either prefabricated survival kits and handbooks or prefabricated shelters. Now, the scenario was that in your suburban backyard, you would dig a trench and install, or you would either install or simply put together your own fallout shelter and stock it with non-perishable items. Now, backyard shelters brought up an uncomfortable situation when neighbors did not purchase or prepare for a nuclear fallout, for a nuclear attack. Many people began to ask themselves, were they obligated to share their fallout shelter with their neighbors who did not prepare? With many going so far as to hypothesize, was it morally conscionable to use a gun or any other sort of weapon to hold off your neighbors and deny them entry into your fallout shelter if they didn't prepare. So it's a sort of like moral dampener on that issue. And also during the 1950s, the intellectuals, they really began to worry about the increasing conformity of the 1950s. As the decade wore on, Americans began to lose their distinctive individualism. A number of books were written to reflect the stifling atmosphere, such as The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, and it really centers on a man, a businessman who's unhappy in his life, who attains material possessions only to find that he is no longer fulfilled as an individual, as a member, and that he's and that he fully comes to realize that he is only in this sort of rat race life. There's no joy, no passion, simply this dull continuance. And indeed, when we analyze this literature, the literature of the 1950s, we find that the old questions that were asked before, and then the subjects that were covered has largely passed. The new questions relating to the new questions that were asked were purely related to psychological anxieties. Nobody was talking about going hungry. Nobody was talking about this sort of real fears, real anxieties that people in the early 1940s, the 1930s, the 1920s were really asking. We even find that if we go back to The Wizard of Oz, what we covered in lectures on the fall of populism and of course the election of 1896, even real questions like that, or even that they even just made statements on present events. Those questions aren't even asked. Everything sort of centered on this prevailing mood of dissatisfied success. More and more advertising came to shape not only the American views of themselves, but the world perception of the United States and of Americans on a very general basis. Now, juvenile delinquency was another concern, with movies like Rebel Without a Cause and The Wild Ones causing great anxieties about the generation to come, about the youth and future. Many began to wonder what will happen when the youth becomes completely alienated from the demands of our society. And many try to apply fixes to the problem. Many began to write books about growing up, with the absurd notion that there were no more manhood trials for boys to sort of temper themselves with. And again, this sort of like touches on what we discussed in our last lecture with Disneyland and Pioneerland, in which many began to look back and say things were better because we had these life instances that just toughened the people up. It was a more pure, more simpler time. People sort of had this phase where they were really uninitiated to the realities of the world, and then they got sharp lessons that toughened them and prepared them for adult social responsibilities. And at the time, the fear was that the generation, the youth of the 1950s simply were not able to be put into that sort of situation, to be put into those manhood trials, the way that previous generations had, that they had been made soft by the new comforts. And other books challenged the education offered at schools. One book, Why Johnny Can't Read, galvanized the fears of parents and policymakers, and this coupled with the launching of Sputnik, led to the passage of the National Defense Education Act to strengthen STEM training in schools. One thing that America at the times did not know, but was to play an important role on future events, was the spread of American culture, which was to play a greater role on the world stage than ever before. Indeed, the United States was not just assuming political leadership over the powers of Western Europe and the rest of the world, but was descending into a global political hegemon role. There was this new sort of hegemony coming into place in which American political ideologies and aspirations were taking center place, but also American culture. This is around the time that Coca-Cola became widely known around the world. Blue jeans took over the world. The American sports car, the American car, American tobacco and so forth, American cigarettes, I should say, Marlboro, really became like recognizable global brands. New York City became the capital of the art world in the 1950s. And again, that American literature sort of harkened to the fact that no more did American authors or artists defer to the old European centers, places like Paris and London, Milan and so forth, Berlin. No longer do these cities have this sort of great cultural aura or appeal or cast any shadows on the United States. New York City began to cast its shadow on those cities, as they became the capital of the art world, and really just the capital of the cultural hub, the cultural capital of the world. A succession of artists like Mark Rothko, Jackson Pollock, and many others who pioneered art styles like abstract expressionism. They began to take more and more of the domestic center stage, but also of the global art world, or I should say the art world at large. Now Pollock gained early fame by painting in a very conventional manner, but he achieved prominence and is best remembered for his drip style painting, in which he would suspend paintbrushes and sticks over canvases, letting the paint just drip indiscriminately on the canvases. Now, one painting, Lavender Mist, is considered one of his great masterpieces, and bears witness to this sort of phenomena of American art storming the world. Pollock liked his style because it was a little bit random. You never knew what you were going to get. Now, certainly over time, he began to notice that he could manipulate the drippings, and he did manipulate the drippings when it suited him. Now, Pollock had his admirers, but he also had his detractors. And interestingly enough, they both alternatively and with different motivations called him Jack the Dripper, a play on the serial killer, the London serial killer Jack the Ripper. A bit macabre, but it's a nickname that stuck. In the 1960s, the pop artists came out, and pop art came into vogue or into fashion with Andy Warhol. And Andy Warhol is perhaps the best known of these artists. And Warhol himself gained fame and a fortune by painting Campbell's soup cans and really bad photograph reproductions of figures like Marilyn Monroe. Now, pop art often had a comical sense, depicting giant hamburgers or clothespins, and the pop artist really challenged the artistic avant-garde in interpreting what was high art and what was vulgar or low art. By the 1950s, American corporations were dominating the world and exporting American products all over the place. I made a reference to Coca-Cola already, but General Motors cars, Kodak cameras, Ford cars, and of course Levi's and their blue jeans were everywhere, and they set their products. They set out to sell their products everywhere, and the product were well received. Coca-Cola still is one of the most popular drinks in the world. I remember when I was a young man, we still had Kodak film developers. You would go to the little booths and so forth and drop off your reels, and in a matter of moments it would be printed for you. You had that sort of 1 hour photo booth and so forth. This was also the golden age of American universities, and their research apparatus was really growing strong at the time. Now, the 50s, for all the good, was also an era of repression, I'd like to say. And from this look on American society, we'll shift into the civil rights movement. And I made a reference earlier that not everybody prospered during this time. There was still really widespread discrimination being practiced against the African American community and other communities. But particularly the African American community. They were a community that was excluded from this affluence, from this great social transformation to a great extent. And in our next couple of lectures, we will examine the civil rights movement of the mid 20th century. And I'll also give a sort of breakdown and a fast fact, maybe a fast fact and a lecture on the different civil rights movements. But that's for our next lecture. And hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture, and I will see you guys next time. And as always, I'm Ted.